There is a line of bare human footprints pressed into the mud of a lake that dried up long ago. They lie in southern New Mexico, on a flat so white that it reads as snow. Someone walked there with nothing at all on their feet. You can see where the toes gripped, where the heel sank, and where the mud pushed up around the edge of it. You can see the exact place where the walker turned. They look like this morning's prints. That is the first strange thing. The edges are crisp, and the arch is clean. The whole line has the ordinary, unhurried look of a person crossing wet ground on a small errand. Then the layers above them and below them were dated, and the answer came back at about 21 to 23,000 years ago. That is the second strange thing. It is many thousands of years before anyone was supposed to be standing anywhere in the Americas at all. So there are 3 questions in front of us, and we are going to carry all 3 of them together. Who was walking there? How did they reach a continent that was supposed to be sealed off behind a wall of ice, and why is there so little else left of them? Settle in. Let your shoulders come down, and keep those 3 questions close, because everything tonight hangs from them. Now the ground itself. The flat sits in a wide closed basin ringed by dry mountains. The floor of that basin is gypsum, not the quartz sand that most deserts are made of. Gypsum is soft and pale, the same mineral as the plaster in your walls. It is so white that on a bright day the light arrives from underneath as well as from above. Walk out onto it, and the whiteness you are standing in runs to the horizon in every direction. There are dunes there, and the dunes move. They travel a few meters a year, slow and enormous, burying and unburying the ground as they go. Underneath them and in the wide flats between them is something much older. A lake bed. Long ago this basin held a lake, and it was shallow, with a soft margin. It was fed by meltwater coming down off the mountains. It has a name now. Lake Otero. At its fullest it was tens of miles across. It was shallow enough that a strong wind could push it around the basin like water in a tilted dish. In wet seasons it spread out thin, and in dry ones it pulled back and left a rim of mud. That rim is where the walking happened. Think of the edge of any shallow water you have stood beside. Firm ground, then softer ground, then mud that takes a print and keeps it. That is the entire mechanism, and there is nothing more to it. A person walks the margin. The mud closes gently around each foot. The sun comes out, and the print sets like something fired in a kiln. Then a film of silt washes over the top, and then another. Then the lake goes away for good, and the wind brings white sand across the basin. One ordinary afternoon is sealed under the floor of a desert for more than 20,000 years. Before we go further out onto that flat, I want to know where you are right now. I cannot know, of course, but I think about it. Somewhere it is early morning, and you are in Berlin with the window still dark and the coffee going cold beside you. Somewhere it is well past midnight in Vancouver, and you are lying in the dark with rain moving on the glass. Somewhere it is the middle of a lunch break in Melbourne, and there is half an hour that belongs to nobody but you. Wherever it is, you are somewhere. That is the part I actually want to hold on to. You are on ground. Your feet are resting on a floor, and that floor is resting on soil. The soil is resting on rock that was here long before any of us, and that is exactly what the walker had, which was ground underfoot, a direction to go in, weather, and an errand. So let me take you back out to the lake. The first thing to understand is that there is not one trackway out there. There are thousands of prints across the basin, human ones and the tracks of animals, laid over each other on the same old surface. It is not a monument, it is a floor that people and animals used, in the way that a path near a house gets used. The second thing is stranger, because most of the time nobody can see them at all. They are called ghost tracks. When the ground is dry, the print and the material filling it look identical. The whole surface is a blank white sheet with nothing written on it. Then rain comes, or the air turns heavy, and the fill takes up water at a slightly different rate than the print does. For a few hours the shapes rise out of the ground like writing in invisible ink. Toes, heels, a whole line of them, running off toward the low ground. Then the flat dries out, and they sink back into the blankness, and they are gone again. Ranchers and soldiers and hikers had crossed that ground for years without ever noticing a thing beneath their boots. Now let me put you down beside one of them. You are standing on the flat well before dawn. The air is cold and very dry. There is a wind coming across the white ground, low and steady, carrying fine grains that tick against your jacket. The surface under your boots is hard, like a dinner plate. Your own footsteps make almost no sound out here. Ahead of you the ground is featureless in the dark, and you would swear there was nothing there to find. Then the light comes up behind the mountains, low and sideways, and the flat changes. Shadows collect in the shallow places. What was blank a minute ago is suddenly a line of bare feet walking away from you across the ground, one after another, evenly spaced. Kneel down. The print in front of you is about the length of your hand. The ball of the foot is pressed deeper than the heel. The toes are splayed a little, the way toes do when they have never once been inside a shoe. Along the inside edge there is a small ridge of mud, pushed up and left there, and it has not moved since. Look at the spacing, and you can read the pace off it. This one was moving quickly, not running, but walking with the weight forward. The way you walk when the light is going and you would rather be home. And then, a few paces on, the line stops going straight. One heel has dug in and turned, and the outer edge of it is deeper. The next print faces a new direction entirely. That is a person changing their mind, or hearing something behind them, or looking back at whoever was following. It is 1 second out of one afternoon, and it is still lying there in the ground. Other tracks come in around it. There are wide round pits, each one big enough to sit down in, crossing the shallows in a slow, unhurried line. Those belong to a mammoth going about its own business. There are the broad clawed prints of a giant ground sloth, a heavy animal about the size of a small car. In one place its tracks show it rising up on its hind legs and turning to look at something. Camels lived there too. Wolves moving neatly and fast. Big cats. All of them alive. All of them moving. All of them sharing one wet margin in the same season. They were close enough to the people that you would have heard them breathing. And then there is the trackway that most people cannot get out of their heads. One person, walking fast and straight for well over a mile, slipping in the places where the mud ran wetter. And every so often, alongside, there is a second set of prints. Very small ones. They appear, and then they stop, and then a while later they appear again. Somebody was carrying a child and setting the child down now and then. The weight shifts from one hip to the other, and then the child is lifted again and they go on. Hours later the same trackway comes back the other way, and the small prints are not with it. We do not know what that means, and it would be wrong to invent an ending for it. A child delivered somewhere most likely, and left with someone else while the errand was finished. But you can feel the whole shape of that afternoon in it, and that is the part that does not let go of people. These are somebody's ancestors, and their descendants are alive right now, in that country, and far beyond it. Look again at what is not on those feet. No sole, no wrap, no hide, nothing at all. Bare skin on cold mud, at the edge of a lake, in the middle of an ice age. That is not carelessness. That is somebody entirely at home, walking ground they knew well, in a place where the mud and the water and the animals were all familiar. Everything I have described so far you could accept without any trouble whatsoever. A lake. A soft edge. People and animals walking across it on an ordinary day. The trouble is the number. Because there was a model, a textbook answer taught confidently for about 60 years. It put the first people on this continent many thousands of years after that walker turned. We will come to it. We will come to the beautiful stone points that the model was built out of. We will come to the wide cold country that once joined Asia to Alaska, and to the long isolation that genetics has found sitting quietly in the middle of the story. We will come to a waterlogged site in southern Chile that has no business being as old as it is. We will come to the corridor everybody was taught about, and to the drowned coastline that answers it better. And at the end we will come back to these dates themselves, and to the argument over them, which was serious and fair, and took years to settle. None of that yet. Stay on the flat a little longer, because before any of it can matter to you, you have to feel how ordinary this is. Nobody out there was making history. Somebody was carrying a child along a lake edge with the light going, and the ground was soft, and the ground kept it. And to understand why one ordinary afternoon caused so much trouble, you first have to understand what it was arguing with. There was a textbook. It stood for about 60 years, and it was built out of something genuinely beautiful. It was built out of stone. A shape, to be exact, and one particular way of finishing that shape, so distinctive that a specialist can pick it out across 2 continents. And to understand why it held for as long as it did, I want to take you off the white flat for a while. Not far. A few hours north and east, and back most of 100 years, to a dry cut in the ground outside a small railroad town. Because that line of bare feet in the mud, and the impossible age attached to it, did not land on an empty page. It landed here, and you cannot feel how hard it landed without knowing how solid this was. The town is called Clovis, and it sits out on the eastern edge of New Mexico. Flat country, big sky, wind that comes a long way before it reaches you. Just outside it there is a shallow basin in the ground called Blackwater Draw. Long ago it held water, a spring-fed pond, reeds at the margin, animals coming down to drink in the early light. Mammoths came to that water in their own slow time, and so did long-horned bison, moving in from the grass in the cool part of the day. By the time our story starts, the pond was long gone, the basin was dry, and men were quarrying gravel out of the bottom of it. Picture yourself standing at the lip of that pit. The sides are cut clean, and you can read the ground like a page laid on its side. Sand, then clay. A dark band of old pond bottom. And in that band, mixed with the remains of animals this continent no longer has, someone found stone points. Not rough ones. Take one in your hand. It is about the length of your middle finger, sometimes less. It is leaf-shaped, tapering to a tip that still catches the light. It is thin. That is the first thing that surprises everybody. Thin and even and symmetrical, with a cross-section like a flattened lens. Run a thumb along the edge and you feel a row of small deliberate scallops where flakes were pressed off one after another, each one placed exactly where it was wanted. Then turn it over and look at the base. There is a groove running up from the bottom, shallow and long, on both faces. That groove is called a flute, and it is why these points have a name of their own. It was made by striking a single long flake off the base of an already finished piece, straight up the middle. Think about what that means. You have already spent hours, maybe days on this object. It has been thinned to the very edge of what stone will bear. And now, at the very end, you set it up and hit it once more. If the strike is wrong, it snaps. Hours or days of work end in that one sound. Modern knappers spend years learning the technique, and many of them will tell you, quietly, that they still lose good pieces to that last blow. So why do it at all? Almost certainly to seat the point in a split shaft, so the binding sits flush and the whole thing runs true. It is a joint. An engineering solution, arrived at in stone, and carried through with a margin for error that most modern workshops would never accept. The makers even ground the edges smooth near the base, so that the sharp stone would not saw through its own bindings. Everything about the piece says patience, and that one last strike says nerve. I want you to hold that detail, because it is the tell. That is not somebody fumbling toward an idea, that is somebody finishing one. And the stone itself travels, turning up hundreds of miles from the outcrops it was quarried from. Particular sources, chosen and returned to across generations. These were people who knew where the good stone lay in a country the size of a continent, and who planned far enough ahead to carry it with them. They buried caches of it too, finished pieces and blanks together, tucked into the ground for a later journey that sometimes never came. There is more to the toolkit than the points as well, blades struck from carefully prepared cores, and rods of bone and ivory, bevelled at the ends and worked smooth. Now here is the part that made a textbook out of it. The points are everywhere. Fluted points of that family turn up from the northern plains to Florida, from the eastern seaboard to the western deserts. And they look alike, not identical, but unmistakably related, so consistent that a specialist can often name the family from a broken edge no longer than your fingernail. Spread across 2 continents, one shared way of doing one very difficult thing. They also seem to arrive all at once. In the dating available at the time, the whole spread compressed into a few centuries around roughly 001 years ago. And underneath them, in layer after layer, people found nothing that looked like a first attempt. No clumsy prototypes, no long apprenticeship in the ground below. Put yourself in the shoes of the researchers looking at that. What would you conclude? You would conclude that these people had just arrived. That the technique came in already finished, carried by a population walking into a land with nobody in it, and that it spread as fast as they did. That is exactly what was concluded, and it became known as Clovis first. First people, first tools, and a date near 13,000 years ago that you could teach with a clear conscience. There was a route they were said to have come by, and we will come to that route later, because it has a story of its own. For now, just hold the shape of the model in your mind, a beginning, a signature, and a very fast spread. It was a good hypothesis, and I want to be fair to it. It explained the evidence that existed, it made predictions, and for a long stretch those predictions kept coming true. Dig below the fluted points, and you find nothing human. again and again. That is not stubbornness. That is a model earning its keep. You would have believed it, and so would I. But something happens to an idea that is right for long enough. It stops being a question. It went into the school books and the museum labels and the first paragraph of nearly every general account. A whole discipline grew up inside it, and that is a quiet sort of trap, because when a model is the air you were trained in, its edges stop looking like edges at all. A working hypothesis is a door propped open. Somewhere in that long stretch, without anyone quite deciding it, the door swung shut. And once it was shut, every claim of an older site had to knock. The questions asked at that door were fair questions, and you would want them asked. 3 of them, mostly, try them on something you believe. Is this stone really worked by human hands, or did nature break it that way? Do the dates truly come from the same layer as the objects, or has something moved? And has the ground been disturbed by burrowing animals, by roots, by water carrying old charcoal down from somewhere else? Those are not hostile questions. Those are the job. Sites do get muddled, and stones do fracture on their own, in ways that flatter the eye of anyone hoping. The people asking were not fools either. Most of them had watched claim after claim come apart under exactly these questions, and that memory is a heavy thing to argue with. The trouble is what the standard quietly became. For an ordinary claim, the test was reasonable doubt. For an early one, it drifted towards something else, beyond any doubt at all. And a test that nothing can pass has stopped being a test. It has become a verdict wearing the clothes of one. So what did that cost? It cost people their working lives. If you announced an early date, you learned quickly what came next. Your paper came back, and then your funding thinned. Your name became a small joke in a conference hall, and you heard about it second-hand, which is worse. Graduate students were advised, kindly and sincerely, to work on something less career-limiting. If you were young in the field, the boundary was learned early, and learned without a word ever being said aloud. 2 things can be true here at the same time. Many of those doubts were honest, and some challenged sites really were wrong. The screen caught bad claims, and it also caught good ones, and held them for decades. One example is enough. There is a rock shelter in Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, dug with unusual care, where the dates from the lowest levels came out older than the model permitted. Its excavator spent much of his career answering objections about it. One at a time, patiently, he was still answering them long after the argument had moved on. Whatever you make of that particular site, notice the shape of what happened to it. The evidence did not get to be interesting, it only ever got to be defended. None of this is a story about villains, and I would not want it heard that way. It is a story about how a good idea calcifies, about how the thing that protects a field from nonsense can also, given enough time and enough confidence, protect it from being corrected. And there is one more thing I need you to carry forward from here. Nothing that came later takes anything away from the Clovis toolmakers. They were not an error. They were real people, deeply skilled, technically inventive, at home across enormous distances of unfamiliar country. They solved a hafting problem with an elegance that engineers still admire. They made objects so well proportioned that one of them could sit in a case beside anything and hold its own. Hand a modern craftsman the same stone and the same tools and a year of practice, and the best of these pieces would still be out of reach. They were not a mistake in the record. They were simply not the beginning. That is the only word that changed. Not their skill, not their reach, not their ingenuity. Only the word first. Everything else about them stands, and stands well, which brings you back to the flat. Notice something small and strange. The town that named the first Americans in every classroom for about 60 years, and the white basin where those bare footprints lie in old lake mud, sit in the same state, a few hours apart. Two dry places in New Mexico, holding two answers that cannot both be complete, and the first real crack in that textbook came from neither of them. It did not come from the north, where everyone was looking. It came from far to the south, from a cold, wet patch of ground where water had done something it almost never does for us, and kept the soft things, wood, cord, hide, from rotting away. We will get there. So the road matters. If the people who left those prints did not arrive the way the old model said, they still arrived. From somewhere. And every argument about how they did it runs, sooner or later, into the same narrow place on the map. The gap between Siberia and Alaska. Today that gap is water and nothing else. About 50 miles of shallow grey sea, with two small islands sitting out in the middle of it, and fog for much of the year. On a clear day you can stand on the Alaskan shore and see the other continent. That is how close the two halves of the world are right now. 50 miles is a distance you could walk in 2 days if the sea were not lying across it. But water is only the current arrangement. Sea level is not a fixed thing. It is a balance, and the balance is held between the ocean and the ice. When the world turns cold, snow falls in the north and does not melt away in summer. It packs down under its own weight. It becomes ice. The ice thickens and spreads and stays year on year for thousands of years together. Every bit of that water was lifted out of the sea and never given back, and so the sea, very quietly, went down. You would never have felt it happening, because it moved slower than any single life could measure. Now think about what that does to a shallow place. The strait between the continents is not a trench, it is a shelf. Across most of it the water is only 40 or 50 meters deep, which in ocean terms is barely water at all. So when the sea fell, that shelf did not simply narrow. It came up into the air, not as a ribbon, not as a causeway, as a country. From its northern coast to its southern coast, the distance was something like 1,000 miles. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is larger than the picture in your head. 1,000 miles is a serious journey by car on a good road, 2 long days of it. It is wider than the whole of France and Spain laid end to end. And it was not there for a season, or a lifetime, or a few hundred years. It stood, open and dry and walkable, for thousands of years at a stretch, long enough for hundreds of generations to be born on it. So let me put you down in the middle of it, and let you look around. The first thing you notice is the wind. It is almost always moving, and it comes across open ground with nothing to break it. Because there is nothing standing anywhere in your view. No forest, no woodland edge, no single tree on a rise to walk toward. The horizon is a clean low line in every direction, and it stays that way for days. Under your feet is grass. Not lawn grass. Tough, fine, pale grasses growing in tussocks, mixed with sedges and low herbs and grey-green sage. In the hollows there is dwarf willow that comes to your ankle, and further off, along the water, willow and alder in real thickets. The ground itself is firm under you, dry, gravelly in places, dusted with fine silt that the wind lifts and carries and lays down again somewhere else. Dry is the word to hold on to. This is a cold place, but it is not a buried one. The great ice sheets sat far to the east, and they pulled the moisture out of the air before it ever got here. So the snow came thin and patchy. Wind scoured the ridges bare. And that one fact, that the snow stayed shallow, is what made the whole country work. Grass that is not buried in winter is grass that can still be eaten in winter, which means the animals did not have to leave. And there were a great many animals, woolly mammoths, moving in family groups, unhurried. The young ones tucked in among the adults. Steppe bison, heavier and longer horned than the bison alive today. Wild horses in loose bands, small and stocky and quick, cropping the grass and lifting their heads together at nothing. Caribou in numbers you would struggle to hold in your eye at once. Musk oxen standing in the wind like dark boulders. If you stood still and stayed downwind, most of them would go on grazing and not mind you at all. Saiga antelope with that strange soft nose drifting through in the hundreds. You would hear them before you saw them, most days. A low sound carried on the wind, and a smudge of dust lifting a mile off, and then the herd coming over the swell of the land, filling the ground and passing, and going on. And there were lions here, and short-faced bears, and wolves keeping their distance at the edge of things. This was not an empty plain. It was one of the richest grasslands the world has ever had. Now the seasons, because they are not what you would guess. In summer the sun does not really set. It swings low around the sky instead, and at what ought to be midnight the light comes in sideways, long and gold and warm on the grass, throwing shadows out behind every tussock. The ground thaws at the top and softens. Meltwater runs. Flowers come up fast and small and bright, because they have so little time. And the birds arrive in millions from every direction to nest on open ground where the light barely leaves. Geese, ducks, waders, all of them loud. Also the mosquitoes, in clouds, because that is honest. Then the light goes, and winter is long and dark and hard. The wind gets teeth, the ground goes iron, but the snow still comes thin, so the herds stay, and the rivers freeze into roads, and the sky on a clear night is enormous. If you were living here, you would have known exactly where the sheltered ground was. You would have known which river bend held willow for a fire, and where the driftwood came ashore. That driftwood matters more than it sounds. Great rivers ran off the Siberian interior and out across this land, and they carried whole trees down from the forests far to the south. Those trees came to rest on the beaches. So on a country with no woodland at all, there was timber lying at the edge of the sea, ready for fires and frames and the ribs of a shelter. And there were two edges, two coasts, which is the part people forget. The northern shore faced the Arctic and its ice. The southern shore faced the Pacific, and it was milder and wetter, with lagoons and river mouths and long gravel spits, and birds and fish coming up into fresh water. A person could live between those coasts and up those rivers for their entire life, and never feel they were anywhere in particular. Only home. Which is why I want you to notice something, wherever you are right now. Look at the room around you, the floor, the wall, the window, whatever is beyond it. That is a place. It has a name you would use, and weather worth complaining about, and ground you know the feel of. It is not the space between two other places. Nobody's home is a corridor. Hold that thought, because it is the whole argument, and the phrase we were all taught gets it exactly wrong. We were taught to call it a land bridge. And that phrase has quietly bent our thinking for 100 years. A bridge is a thing you cross. It is narrow, it is temporary, it has a near end and a far end, and you can see across it. Every one of those ideas is false here. You could not see across. Standing anywhere in the middle of that plain, there was no far shore in view, no hint of another continent waiting, no sense of being partway over anything. Asia was not behind you, and America was not ahead of you, because neither of those ideas existed yet. There was grass, and weather, and the herds, and the rivers, and the two seas at the far ends of a very large world. A bridge is crossed in a day. This was inhabited for millennia. Think about how long that really is. If people were living out there for even 4 or 5,000 years, then children were born on that plain, whose grandparents had been born on that plain, whose grandparents again had been born on that plain. Nobody was passing through. They were simply from there. Their stories would have been about that river, that headland, that stretch of coast where the wood came in. So the honest way to say it is this. There was no bridge. There was a country, roughly the size of a subcontinent, cold and dry and open and full of living things, and it happened to be joined at both ends to what we now call two different worlds. Scientists gave it a name much later, Beringia, borrowed from a navigator who sailed that strait long after the water had come back over everything. Whatever the people who lived there called it, we will not learn it. That name went under with the ground, because the ground did go under. When the world warmed and the ice began to let go, all that held water came back to the sea, and the sea came back across the shelf. Not as a wave, as a slow, patient, decade-by-decade rising, an inch of shoreline at a time, marsh becoming lagoon, lagoon becoming bay. The plain flooded from its low middle outward. The coasts walked inland. And the country thinned and broke and finally closed into what you see on a map now, two continents almost touching, with cold sea between them. The high ground is still up there if you know to look. Those small islands out in the strait, and the bigger ones further south, are not islands the way most islands are. They are the hilltops of a drowned country. And now and then a fishing net comes up off the sea floor with something in it that does not belong to the ocean at all. A mammoth tooth, a piece of tusk rolled smooth, grassland handed back up through the water. So hold that map in your mind, and then set the mystery beside it again. Far to the south, on a white flat that was once a lake, a person walked barefoot through soft mud and left the shape of their toes in it. And the ground kept it. Whoever they were, their people came from somewhere, and this cold grassy country is where the road has to begin. But knowing where a road begins is not the same as knowing when anyone set out on it, or how long they lingered. And there is a reason to think they lingered a very long time indeed. It is not written in stone tools, or in anything you could pick up and turn over in your hand. It is written inside living people. So they stayed. Not everyone, and not forever. But the picture the science gives us now is not of a people hurrying. It is of a people at home. And the thing that tells us so is not a stone tool, or a hearth, or a line of bare prints in old mud. It is quieter than that. It is us. Because the record of that country is not held only in the ground. Some of it is carried, right now, inside living people. Some of it is carried inside you, in a different arrangement. Every one of us is a document. You are walking around inside a copy of a copy of a copy, going back further than any archive on this planet, and the copying is very nearly perfect. Very nearly. That small imperfection is the whole trick. Let me lay it out plainly, and slowly. There is no hurry in any of it. When life is passed on, the instructions get copied. The copy is astonishingly good, but it is not flawless. Here and there a single letter comes out different. Most of those differences do nothing at all. They sit there harmless, like a smudge in the margin of a book you would never notice. And because they do nothing, nothing removes them. They simply get copied onward, generation after generation, to everyone descended from the person they first appeared in. So a smudge becomes a marker. One family carries it, then a wider group carries it, and given long enough a whole people carries it, while the people over the next range of hills do not. Now picture two groups of people who see each other often. They marry across, they move back and forth, their smudges get shared out between them, and the two sets stay tangled together. But let those groups stop meeting, and the sharing stops with them. Each side keeps collecting its own small differences. The sets slide apart. So you can count the differences and divide by the rate at which they appear and get a rough number of years since those two sets of people last held anything in common. That is the clock. It is not a precise clock, and any honest researcher will tell you so before you ask, but it is a real one, and it runs whether or not anyone is watching it. You may be wondering how anyone gets hold of the old copies at all. It is a good deal harder than it sounds. Once a person's life is over, the long strands begin coming apart, and what survives is not a tidy text, but confetti. In cold, dry ground the confetti lasts longer. A laboratory can lift those fragments out, read them a few letters at a time, read them again millions of times over, and let a computer settle the pieces back into order. It is patient, unglamorous work, and in a single working lifetime it has rewritten more of the human past than any spade you could name ever did. Hold that gently for a moment, because now I can tell you what it says. Read the ancestry of the peoples of the Americas backwards, and you find a branch. It parts from its nearest relatives across in Asia, and after that the two sides go their own ways. So far, so ordinary. Here is the part that made people sit up in their chairs, and it should do the same for you. After that parting, the branch does not split again. It just runs. On and on, a single line, with no great fanning out into daughter groups. And then, much later, it splits many times over in what looks like a rush, as people spread south across two enormous continents. Two events then, a separation from the west and a spreading to the south. And in between, thousands of years of nothing but continuity, which is the part to hold on to as you listen. That gap is the thing. Researchers call it a standstill, though the word is a little unfair, because nobody stood still. It only means that from the outside, for a very long stretch, this population is not exchanging with anyone, and it is not yet going anywhere. It is somewhere in or near that cold grass country you have already been standing in. And it is, quietly, becoming a distinct people. How long? The estimates move, and they will keep moving as the work improves. Several thousand years at the very least. Some readings stretch it a good deal further than that. What is not really in doubt is that it lasted long enough to leave a mark you can still read today. Isolation leaves a particular fingerprint, and this is the shape of it. The variety you would expect from a large, well-connected population simply is not there. What you find instead is a smaller company of people, turned inward, carrying their differences around among themselves for a very long time. Some of that reading comes from the genomes of living people, done in partnership with the communities whose own story it is. Some of it comes from ancient remains, recovered from ground that has stayed cold for a very long time. And when I say ancient remains, I want to be plain with you about what those are. They are somebody's ancestors. They are handled that way now, with care and with permission, and that is exactly as it should be. What the reading shows underneath is a braid. Two older lineages run into this population. One of them is northern, deep in Siberia, from people who were living far up in that cold long before any of this began. The other is an East Asian lineage, from further south and east. Somewhere in the north those two long histories meet, and they join, and the joining becomes the ancestry that everyone in the Americas afterwards inherits. As the numbers currently sit, the eastern share is the larger of the two, and the northern share is real and substantial. I want to be careful about how that lands, because ancestry gets talked about badly. None of it is a ranking. There is no pure line and no diluted one. There is no first-rate stock and no second. Not here, not anywhere on earth. Your own ancestry is a braid as well. And so is mine. And so is everybody's, all the way down. Populations meeting and joining is not some accident in human history. It is the ordinary shape of it. What happened up in the north is the same thing that happened everywhere else, in different weather. And the machinery that carries it is the same machinery in you, the same letters, the same copying, the same slow gathering of harmless smudges that lets anyone read any of this at all. So when you follow that line north, you are not looking at somebody else's biology through glass. You are looking at your own, running along a different valley. And now the part I find hardest to hold, and the part worth taking slowly. Thousands of years. Say it and it sounds like a measurement. Live it and it is something else entirely. So put yourself down inside it. It is a long evening in the middle of summer, and the light will not properly go. The grass runs to the edge of sight in every direction, moving all at once when the wind crosses it. Big animals are out there, feeding, unhurried, moving the way weather moves. The air smells of cold ground and green. You know the name of every person within a day's walk, and they know you. There are no strangers here. Nobody arrives. You sleep when the light finally dims and wake into the same enormous quiet, and the quiet is not loneliness. It is simply the size of the world you have. That is one evening. Now let it repeat. Someone is born into that country, learns it by heart, grows old in it, and is remembered afterwards by the people who follow. That whole life, every season of it, every hard winter and every good year, is one bead. Now thread 200 of those beads, one after another. That is your standstill. 200 generations, near enough. 200 sets of grown lives, laid end to end, in one place, out of contact with everybody else alive. If you tried to walk that back one life at a time, starting tonight, the counting would run on long after every name in your memory had run out. Think about what that does to a people. Language spoken only here drifts into its own shape, and the drift is nobody's decision. Songs are made and kept and worn smooth by use. Every fold in the ground gets a name, and the name gets a story, and the story gets older than anyone can trace. Ways of doing things settle in until they stop feeling like choices at all. That is not a pause in history. That is history happening. And it matters to say this clearly, so let me say it. They were not waiting. Nobody in that country stood at the edge of the grass with an unfinished continent at their back, wondering when it might be time to go. They were living. The lives were whole and full and theirs. Standstill is our word, invented long afterwards by people reading a pattern from a very great distance, and I think it says rather more about our impatience than about theirs. Which is worth sitting with if you are somewhere warm and quiet right now, because it is easy to hear thousands of years as empty time. It was not empty. It was the fullest kind of time there is. It was ordinary days, in enormous numbers, in a place that nobody today has ever seen. Still, something did change. Eventually, the braid holds, and the isolation holds, and then the line splits, and splits again, and splits again, and people are suddenly everywhere south of the ice, from one end of the Americas to the other. When a population that has been to itself for that long finally moves, it moves like water finding a way down. And that is exactly where all of this runs back into the trouble we started with, because there is still a set of bare footprints out there, pressed into the mud of a lake that dried up long ago on a white flat in the south. Toes, a heel, a turn in the walk, and the age that came back from that ground sits awkwardly against every tidy account of when anyone first came south, including the one you have just heard. So the standstill gives us a who. It gives us a people with time enough to become themselves before they went anywhere at all, which is a far better answer than the old story ever had. What it does not give you is a road, and the road is the difficult part, because whichever way you turn it, the ground between that northern country and a lake bed in the desert has to be crossed somehow, by somebody, early. Far earlier than anyone was ready to allow, which is why before we go anywhere near the walkers themselves, we have to go 10,000 miles in the wrong direction, to a cold wet creek bank at the other end of the world where somebody found a piece of knotted string, so they went south. That is a short sentence for an enormous thing. Hold it lightly, because we are leaving the north entirely now, and going somewhere with no ice in it at all. I want you to come with me down the whole length of the Americas, past the plains and past the narrow waste where the two continents join, past the long western spine of mountains, south and south again, until the map begins to run out of room. In the far south of Chile there is a small creek in a wet cool forest called Chinchihuapi. It is not much to look at. Brown water, a sandy cut bank, low trees leaning over it, moss on everything. If you stood there now, you would hear running water and birds and very little else, and you would not give it a second look. Almost nobody did, for a very long time. The story starts with a cart track. Ox carts cross the creek at a shallow place, season after season, and the crossing slowly wore down. You have walked over 100 fords like it. The bank slumped, and water took the rest. And out of the raw cut came wood and bone that were plainly not recent. People living nearby picked some of it up. There was no excavation, no plan, nobody watching. A piece of it reached the university in the nearest city, and from there it reached an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay. He went out to have a look, expecting one season of work perhaps. He stayed with that creek bank, on and off, for the better part of 20 years. Now, why does this one creek matter so much? Stay with me, because the answer is not really about what was found. It is about what did not rot. Think about what normally survives from very long ago. Stone, bone, fired clay, if anyone was making it. And that is close to the whole list. Everything else, every basket, every cord, every wooden handle, every hide and mat and peg and knot, goes back into the ground within a few years. Air gets into the soil, water moves through it, and small living things do the rest, patiently and completely. So at most sites of this age, you are looking at the hard skeleton of a life. The stone tools are there, but the people who used them are almost entirely gone. Now take an ordinary camp and put a bog on top of it. That is what happened here. Soon after the place was left, the ground stayed wet, and a layer of peat grew over it and kept growing. Peat is waterlogged and airless. The organisms that take things apart need oxygen, and beneath standing water there is almost none. So the taking apart slows, and then very nearly stops. The camp went under a wet blanket and stayed there. What you get, in other words, is the soft half of a life, the half that never survives. Let me tell you what came out of that peat, because it still gives archaeologists a strange feeling in the chest. Wooden stakes, sharpened and still sharp enough to catch on your thumb, driven into the ground exactly where somebody drove them. Lengths of cord, made from a marsh reed, wound around some of those stakes to hold them. There were knots in the cord, actual knots, tied by fingers, still holding. You can lift your own hand and make the shape of the movement that tied one, and you will not be far wrong. Fragments of hide, pressed flat, still plainly hide. Planks and posts, and one piece of wood with a hole worked through it. And when the whole excavation was drawn out together, what you had was not a scatter. It was a plan. There had been a long shelter along that creek, longer than the room you are sitting or lying in now. A frame of poles on a low foundation of sand and gravel, divided along its length into bays, like rooms in a row. Each bay had its own small hearth, scooped into the floor and lined with clay. The frame had been covered with hides, staked down at the edges by those pegs and that cord. A little apart from it stood a second structure, a different shape entirely. Say that back in your own head, slowly a long shelter of poles and skins with rooms in it, and a fire in every room. Somebody chose where the doorway went, and somebody decided which bay was theirs. And there were plants everywhere, dozens of kinds, seeds, fruits, roots, tubers, stems, some of them chewed and set aside. Some from the marsh, some from the forest, some from higher ground far off. And seaweed. 9 kinds of seaweed, from a shore that lay a good walk to the west, carried inland and kept the way you would keep anything useful. That is not people hurrying through. That is people living somewhere, knowing their whole country, the wet ground, the woods, the hills, the sea. Now the number. The layer holding all of that has been dated to about 14,500 years ago. Sit with it, because the number by itself is not the shock. The shock is the number laid over the map. Put your finger at the top of that map and drag it down. The old textbook said the first people entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago in the far north. This is not the far north. This is roughly 10,000 miles south of the ice, the length of one continent, then the join, then the length of another, nearly to the bottom of the world. And there were families living there, under a built roof, with knots and hearths and stores of food, more than 1,000 years before anyone was supposed to have arrived. You cannot make that work. No arrangement of the old story survives it. Because here is the thing about distance. You do not reach the far end of a continent on the day you enter it. People move the way people move, a valley at a time, a generation at a time. Stopping where the living is good, staying while the children grow, going on when there is a reason to go on. So the distance is the argument. It is the whole argument. If there are families in southern Chile then, there were people in the north a great deal earlier. Not slightly earlier, but thousands of years earlier. The far end of the road tells you the road was already old, which is exactly why nobody believed it. I want to be fair to the doubters. They were not being stubborn for sport. They were doing the job properly. A claim this large has to be tested hard, and everything about this one was awkward. Sit in their chairs a moment and you will feel it. A site on the far side of the world from most of the journals, published slowly and in enormous detail, in volumes that took years to appear. And the crucial evidence was soft, and soft evidence is the easiest kind to argue about. Wood can be shaped by water and by animals until it looks worked. A creek shifts things, and can carry an old scrap of charcoal down and lay it beside a younger stone tool. Roots push down through layers, and water carries carbon through them. If you had been asked to referee that, you would have wanted more as well. There was history in the room too. Every previous claim of very early people had eventually come apart under examination. Every one. When you have watched that happen a dozen times, the 13th claim does not get a warm welcome. So the argument went on. For years, and then more years, and it turned personal the way long arguments do. Papers and replies, and conference sessions where people did not look at each other afterwards. After nearly 20 years of it, the thing had set into a standoff. One side had a site, the other side had a rule. And then somebody suggested the obvious. Go and look. Late in the last century, a group of the leading septics agreed to travel to Chile and look for themselves. Not read about it. Go there. I want you to picture it, because it is a wonderful piece of human behaviour. 9 or so of the most exacting people in the field, several of them senior. Several had spent their working lives holding the line against exactly this kind of claim. They flew to the southern end of South America. They spent days in the university going through the collections case by case, checking labels against notes, and notes against the plans, and the plans against the objects. Then they drove out to the creek in the rain, climbed down into the ground, and looked at the layers with their own eyes. You know what that costs, not the travel, the other thing. Every one of them walked into that trench holding the live possibility that they had been wrong in public, in print, for years. Imagine having to say that out loud with your own name attached. They looked, they talked, and then they agreed. They signed a joint statement saying the site was what it claimed to be, a real human occupation, older than the model allowed, and that was the moment the old model gave way. Not a discovery, not a new machine, not one spectacular object. A group of people standing in a wet trench in Chile, deciding together that the evidence in front of them beat the idea in their heads. The textbook started changing within a year or two. Let me be honest with you, because the story is better honest. Not everyone stayed convinced. At least one of the visitors published fresh doubts later, and the fine detail of that site has been argued over ever since. Some of it still is, that is fine, it is the process doing what it is built to do. But the door was open, and it did not close again. Once one site had come through, other sites that had been waiting quietly began to get a fair hearing. There turned out to be more of them than anyone expected, and you will meet them soon enough. So the old rule was finished. The first people were not the first people. Now hold this next part gently, because it is where the ground tilts under you. Monte Verde is early. Monte Verde is also, measured against that white flat in New Mexico, very late. Bare feet, in old lake mud, thousands of years older than a shelter at the bottom of the world. If a camp in Chile broke the model by 1,000 years, the footprints break whatever replaced it by several thousand more. And the question comes back larger than before, standing right in front of you. How did anyone get down there? They did not fly. They did not tunnel. And the north was under a very great deal of ice. There is a route you were probably taught, a gap between two ice sheets opening like a door, and people walking south through it into an empty continent. It is a good story. It is drawn on every old map, a neat arrow running down the middle of the ice. But when you go and ask the ice itself when that door opened, and what was growing in there when it did, the answer is not the one the arrow promises. So let me take you to the top of that gap, and we will wait there together for it to open. That is the trouble with a distance like that. It will not sit still in your mind, and it will not let you keep the tidy version of the story. Once you allow people to be standing at the far southern end of the world, you owe an answer about the road, not about their tools, and not about their dates. The road. How does a person get from the top of one continent all the way down to the bottom of another one? And there is only one road most of us were ever taught. So let it go quiet for a moment and come up off the ground with me. Rise until the northern half of the map lies flat beneath you. Take away the borders and the highways, the wheat fields and the lights of the cities. What is left, across very nearly all of it, is white. 2 sheets of ice, and that is the shape of the problem. The eastern one is the larger by an enormous margin. It grew outward from centres near the great cold bay in the north, spreading until it lay over the whole northeast and most of the middle of the continent. Picture ice a mile deep, and in places closer to 2. Deep enough that the rock beneath it sank under the weight, the way a mattress settles under the flat of your hand. If you could stand at the edge of it, you would not read it as weather at all. You would read it as a country in its own right, one that happens to be made of water. The western sheet began in the mountains along the Pacific side, as small glaciers in high valleys, thickening quietly, spilling, joining, until the ranges themselves were buried and the ice moved as one body down the western spine of the continent. 2 sheets, then, one born in the mountains, one born in the east. And for a long stretch of the cold time, their edges leaned toward each other along the eastern flank of the Rockies until they touched. And where they touched, they merged, one continuous wall, from the western sea to the eastern one. No gap, no seam, no door. Keep that shape somewhere in your mind, because everything that follows depends on it. Ice on the mountains, ice across the east, and a line down the middle where the 2 of them are pressed together. That is not a wall that stands for a season. It stands for far longer than any of us can hold in our heads, generation after generation, while the people we are following are living their whole lives somewhere else. Then let the world begin to warm, and the ice begins to give. You should know that it does not go the way a tide goes out. Ice of that size thins from the top long before it steps back from the front. It stalls for a lifetime. It surges forward in one valley while it falls back in the next. But the weight is leaving, and over centuries the two great bodies of ice stop leaning on one another, and their edges draw apart. Between them, running roughly north to south, a seam opens. That seam has a name you have almost certainly heard before: the ice-free corridor. It is easy to see why it convinced so many people for so long. On a printed map it is a beautiful thing, a pale channel between two white masses running down from the far northwest along the eastern side of the mountains out onto the open plains. Somebody draws an arrow through it, and the arrow points south. And then the whole peopling of a hemisphere gets told with one clean line on one page. You were probably taught that arrow. So was I. But an arrow on a map answers nothing, and there are two plain questions it never touches. When did that gap actually open? And what was inside it when it did? Take the first one, because it is the easier of the two. Geologists have walked that route with cores and drills, pulling up the mud from the bottoms of the lakes strung out along it. Mud keeps time. It settles in layers, season upon season, and each layer holds pollen and grains and the faint genetic traces of whatever was living nearby. You can date those layers, and if you do it patiently enough, you can watch a whole landscape come back to life in slow motion. There is a second clock as well, and this one is alive. Bison. When the ice closed, it split the bison of the north from the bison of the south, and the two populations sat apart for thousands of years, drifting genetically, becoming distinguishable from one another. When the route reopened, they mixed again. Their descendants still carry the record of that reunion, and a reunion like that can be dated. Put the clocks together, and what you get is a shape rather than one sharp line. The two ice sheets stopped touching earlier than people used to assume, perhaps somewhere near 14,000 or 15,000 years ago along parts of the route. But a space between two walls of ice is not yet a road. For a corridor that a person could actually travel, with food and fuel along the way. The honest answer sits closer to 13,000 years ago. Hold that number lightly for a minute, because we will come back to it. The second question is the one that undoes the arrow completely. What was in there? Come down onto the ground with me and walk it. You are standing at the northern mouth of the gap. It is summer, which matters, because in winter you would not be standing here at all. The wind is coming off ice on your left, and there is ice on your right as well. Both walls are further away than you expected, and higher and dirtier than the word ice suggests, streaked grey and brown with the ground rock they carry. The sound is the first thing you notice. Water everywhere, all of it moving and none of it clean. Meltwater comes off both walls in 1,000 small channels, and every channel runs pale as watered milk, thick with rock flour so fine that it will not settle. Under your bare feet, stone, not soil. Stone that was scraped smooth and then scored in long parallel grooves, all running the same way, all pointing back to where the ice went. Gravel and cobbles between the outcrops. Boulders the size of a room, set down at random wherever the ice let go of them. Now look for something to eat. There is nothing, and that is not a figure of speech. In the first centuries after the ice pulls back, there is no soil to speak of, because soil is made by living things and the living things have not arrived yet. No grass, no willow, no berry bushes, no birch scrub, no firewood anywhere, in a place where the wind comes off ice from two sides at once. No mice in the stones, and no birds working the shallows. And no herds. Nothing walks a country with no plants in it. Ahead of you the ground drops away into a lake, and the lake has no far shore that you can see. These are meltwater lakes, and they are enormous, and they are temporary. Ice dams them, and ice moves. When a dam gives way, a lake the size of a small sea can empty in a matter of weeks, and what it leaves behind is raw mud and stranded blocks of ice slowly going to water in the sun. Then the wind takes the flats. It lifts the fine silt off the drained lake beds and carries it for miles, until on a bad afternoon the whole of the air is grey with it. It gets into cloth. It gets into food. Even the dust in this place is groundstone. So you turn along the shore, because there is no other choice, and the walk grows longer than the map ever promised. Now let the scale of it settle on you, quietly, without any alarm. This passage runs something like 1,500 kilometres from end to end. Call it 900 miles. Many hundreds of miles of scoured rock and pale water and cold wind. And for the first stretch of its existence, not one living thing along it that a person or an animal could eat. You would have to carry the entire journey on your back, every meal, every stick of fuel, through a country that offers you nothing at all, and takes your warmth all day and all night. People did travel it later, once the country had made itself habitable. The willows came first, low and stubborn along the meltwater channels. Grass took longer, and soil longer still, and only then did the herds move back up into it. It became a real route, used in both directions, and there is no shame in that. It is simply a later part of the continent's life, and not the first part. And here is where the arrow breaks. Set the two dates side by side. The corridor becomes a place a human being could survive somewhere around 13,000 years ago. Yet by then, people were already living far to the south of it, thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles further on, at the other end of the world. They were south before the door opened. Sit with that, slowly, because it is the whole point of this stretch of the story. The route almost everyone was taught cannot have been the first route. Not because the geology is shaky, but because the arithmetic will not bend. You cannot arrive through a door that is still shut, and you cannot walk a road that has nothing on it, and the people whose worked wood and cordage and hearths we can hold in our hands today were already settled at the far end of the journey, while the ice in the north was still leaning together. The corridor is not a lie, it is only late. That is a strange thing to sit with, and I would like you to feel it rather than hurry past it. For something like 60 years, that pale channel between two ice sheets was the answer to how a hemisphere came to be peopled. It was in the atlases, and it was in the classrooms. It was drawn with such confidence that hardly anyone stopped to ask what a traveller would have eaten along the way. And all the while the door was still shut. So the question does not go away. It gets sharper. Somewhere far to the south, on a white flat that used to be a lake, there are bare footprints pressed into old mud. Toes, a heel. The place where a walker turned around. Made by someone who was already there, on the wrong side of a wall of ice, thousands of years before the only road we ever drew on a map was open, which leaves exactly one direction left to look. Not through the ice. Around it. So the road everybody was taught about turns out to be a door that opened late. That leaves a plain problem sitting in front of us, and it will not go away. People were already living far south of the ice, and they were there long before that gap between the sheets was any use to anybody. If they did not come down through the middle of the continent, then they came another way. And there is really only one other way to come. They came along the edge. I want you to turn west with me for a while, away from the sheets and the gap and the dry interior, out to where the land stops and the cold water starts. There is a line there, It runs from the far north all the way down to the southern end of the Americas, unbroken, tracing every bay and headland and river mouth on the way. It is the Pacific shore. And a shore is not a barrier. A shore is a road that feeds you while you travel along it. Picture the boat first, because everything else rests on the boat. It is small and lighter than anyone expects the first time they lift one. A frame of driftwood and bent green wood, lashed at every joint, covered with sewn hide that has been worked soft and then greased until it turns the water away. One person can raise an end of it. Two can carry the whole thing up a beach and set it down on the stones above the tide. In the shallows it floats high, like a leaf. Now put yourself inside it. You are sitting low, much lower than feels natural, and the hull flexes under you with every swell that passes beneath. It is alive the way a good tool is alive. You feel the shape of the water through the hide the way a floor comes up through a thin shoe. The air is cold and washed clean, and the light off the sea is bright enough to make you squint under a grey sky. Your hands are busy and warm. Everything else is cold, and the cold here is simply the weather. Around you the water is anything but empty. Below the surface the kelp stands in long columns, rooted to the rock, rising 10 metres and more toward the light, and it sways all together, slowly like a forest in a wind nobody can feel. Fish hang in the shade of it. Seals come up beside the boat to look at you, and roll, and go down, and surface again further off. Sea otters lie on their backs in the drifting mats with their paws folded. Birds work the tide line in loud, wheeling crowds. At low water the rocks come out of the sea black with mussels, and a meal can be gathered in a few minutes, by hand, without a tool of any kind. That is the whole argument, and it fits into a single sentence. A kelp forest is among the richest living places on this planet, and it runs almost the entire way south. Researchers have a name for the idea: the Kelp Highway. Think about what an edge like that gives you. You never have to learn a new country. The kelp is the kelp. The seals behave the way seals behave. The same line, the same hook, and the same reading of tide and weather still work 1,000 miles further on. A family can move south and be completely competent the moment they land, and nobody has to invent anything new in order to keep going. And the going is easy, because water carries weight that shoulders cannot. An entire life fits into 2 boats: hides, tools, cord, children, fire, and one morning on the water covers what would take days on foot through timber and swamp. There is no hurry in any of it. Nobody is crossing a continent on purpose. But a slow drift down an edge, over 10 generations, adds up to a distance that is hard to believe until somebody measures it. The route shelters people as well. Along much of that shore, islands stand offshore in long broken chains, and behind them the water goes quiet. You paddle down a green corridor with surf sounding on the far side of the rocks, and nothing but ripples on your own side. When it blows hard, you land and you wait. There is always another beach. Did the ice not come down to the sea? In places it did. Glaciers stood in the water and carved and filled the bays with floating white. But not everywhere along that coast, and not for the whole of the cold. There were pockets that stayed open, islands and headlands with plants growing on them and animals living on them right through the worst of it. We know that because the plants left their pollen in the ground and the animals left their traces beside it. If a bear could live along that coast, a family in a boat could pass down it. So, that is the leading answer. Boats, a rich edge running south, with no barren middle to cross at any point along the way. It is elegant, it fits the dates, and most of the people working on this now think it is broadly right. And here is exactly where it walks into the sea. Hold the ice in your mind for a moment. All that water standing frozen across the north of the world had to come from somewhere, and it came out of the ocean. With that much of it locked up on land, the sea sat far lower than it sits today, lower by about 120 metres. Say that number slowly, because it is a hard thing to feel. 120 metres of depth taken off the whole ocean at once. So the coastline was not where you would draw it. In the steep places it stood a few hundred metres further out. On the wide shelves and around the great bays it stood out by tens of kilometres. There were plains out there, with rivers crossing them, and lagoons lying behind beaches that ran on for days. Now ask where you would set a camp on a coast like that. Not high on a ridge, away from everything. At the water, where the boats come in, where the shellfish are, and where a stream you can drink from runs down across the sand. Their camps sat on the shore, because the shore was the entire point of being there. And then the ice melted, and the sea came back up, and it came up over all of it. It did not happen in an afternoon. It took thousands of years, in slow pulses, and that is worse rather than better. A rising sea does not politely cover a beach and then leave it undisturbed. It works across it. Surf takes a shoreline apart and carries it away grain by grain, and then moves inland and starts on the next one. Some of those places are simply gone. Others lie buried under many metres of mud in a drowned river mouth, 20 kilometres offshore, in cold dark water with a tide running over them. Stand anywhere on that coast today, and the ground you want is out past the shallows, under the swell, beyond the last line of breaking water. So look at what you are being asked to accept here. To test the idea properly, you would have to excavate the coast those people actually used. You cannot walk it. You cannot see it. You need a ship, sonar, cores, divers, and a great deal of money. And even then you are searching a drowned country the size of a nation for a hearth the size of a kitchen table. The evidence is not missing because they were not there. It is missing because it is underwater. That distinction is worth resting on for a moment, because it is easy to say and surprisingly hard to hold. People are trying. Surveys off the coast of British Columbia have mapped old river channels and old shorelines down there in the dark, and have brought up worked stone from ground that was dry land when people were moving. It is thin, and it is a beginning rather than a proof. Meanwhile, up on the dry land where you can still dig, the dates keep arriving early. In Idaho, on a terrace above a river, a site called Cooper's Ferry has given up tools and hearths at around 16,000 years, from careful, patient, long-running excavation that most researchers accept. And look at where it sits, well up a river system that drains to the Pacific, which is precisely where you would expect people to turn inland from a coast. In Florida, at Page Ladson, tools lie in a sinkhole in a riverbed at about 14,500 years. That site is excavated by divers underwater, which is a small joke the world is having at our expense. It is solid, and it sits on the far side of the continent from any Pacific beach. In Oregon, at Paisley Caves, dry sediments have preserved human traces carrying human DNA at about 4,300 years, alongside stone points made in a style that is not Clovis at all. It was argued over for years, mostly over whether that Dina had washed down from the layers above. The work answered the objection. It stands. Then there is Chiquihuite Cave, high in the mountains of northern Mexico, where broken stone has been claimed as tools at more than 25,000 years. That one is not settled, and you should not lean any weight on it. A great many careful people think those pieces are natural breakage, and the cave has produced no dina and no clear hearths. It may be extraordinary, it may be nothing at all. Take the four of them together, and do not read them as a list. Read them as a shape. 3 are solid, and all 3 are older than that corridor could possibly have delivered anybody. They are scattered from Idaho to Oregon to Florida, which tells you something quiet and enormous. Those people were not arriving. They were already spread right across a continent, living in wet sinkholes and dry caves and on river terraces above the salmon. And the arrival is always older than the oldest site you have found. Always. So the coast answers the how, and the sites agree with it, and for one moment the whole picture hangs together beautifully. Except for one thing. Every site named here is still thousands of years younger than a line of bare footprints pressed into lake mud on a white flat in New Mexico. 16,000 years is not 23,000. Boats can bring people down that edge early, and they can bring them down quietly, but nothing on the map yet reaches back far enough to meet those prints. Which means everything now rests on a single question, and it is not a question about boats at all. It is a question about the layers those toes pressed into, about the seeds in them, and the pollen, and the grains of sand underneath, about how anyone can know the age of a footprint at all. Were the dates right? Which brings us back to the white flat, and to the prints. You have been away from them for a while, and I took you a long way round to get here. North to a country that is now under the sea, south to a rainy creek in Chile, and then out along an edge that nobody can walk any more. All of it was in service of one line of bare footprints pressed into old lake mud. So come back with me now and stand over them again. The light is low, the ground is white and hard and faintly ridged, and the wind is moving along it the way it always does out there. Because the first question anyone asked about these prints was not who walked here. It was simpler than that, and much harder to answer. How do you know? That is the argument I want to walk you through now, and I think it may surprise you. It is the best thing in the whole story, not because somebody cheated, but because nobody did. Start with something oddly comforting. You cannot date a footprint. There is nothing in it to date. A print is an absence. A shape pressed into mud. A place where something is not. It holds no carbon of its own, and there is no clock inside it anywhere. So when you hear a number attached to these prints, that number was never taken from the print itself. It was taken from the mud around it. The mud out there lies in layers, fine bands laid down season after season on the floor of the old lake. The prints sit on one of those surfaces. Below them is older mud. Above them, the mud that settled afterwards and sealed them in. If you can date the layer underneath and the layer on top, then you have caught the walker between two numbers. Nobody dates the moment itself. You close a door on either side of it, and the moment is somewhere in the room. To close those doors you need something in the mud that was once alive, and here that something was seeds. They are very small. They belong to a water plant called ruppia, ditch grass, a plain straggly thing that grows in shallow salty water and impresses nobody at all. It grew in the shallows of that lake, it flowered and seeded, and the seeds sank. Season after season they gathered in the mud in thin dark bands. Above the prints, below the prints, exactly where you would want them to be. Those seeds were dated by radiocarbon, and radiocarbon is worth 1 honest minute of your attention because everything after this depends on it. High in the air, cosmic rays are making a rare and unstable form of carbon, all the time. It mixes into the atmosphere. Living plants take it in along with the ordinary kind, in whatever proportion the air happens to hold. Then the plant dies, and the taking in stops. From that moment the unstable carbon turns quietly into something else, at a rate we have measured to a very fine edge. Count what is left, and you know how long ago the breathing stopped. That is a beautiful clock, and for a plant that breathes air, it is close to unarguable. Ruppia does not breathe air. Here is where the trouble came in. A water plant takes its carbon from the water it sits in, from carbon dissolved in the lake rather than carbon floating above it, and lake water is not the same as sky. Water that has run through limestone or lain underground in rock for a long age before it surfaced arrives already carrying carbon that is old. Carbon that left the air long ago and has been decaying ever since. Out of sight, in the dark. So a plant drinking that water is born old, and its clock does not start at 0, it starts partly run down. And a clock that starts partly run down will always lie in the same direction. It will read too old. That is the reservoir effect, and it is real, measurable, and not at all rare. In some lakes it is worth a century or two, and nobody loses any sleep. In hard water it can be worth thousands of years. So the seed dates came back at roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years. Thousands of years earlier than the textbook allowed anyone to be standing there. And a great many careful people looked at those little seeds and said, "Wait, that plant drank the lake." How old was the water in the lake? I want you to sit with that objection for a moment, because I suspect you will like it more than you expect to. It was not obstruction, and it was not somebody guarding a reputation. It was the correct thing to say. The claim on the table was enormous, and an enormous claim resting on a single method with one known weakness is not a fact yet. It is a proposal. The right answer to a proposal like that is never applause. It is, show me another way. You may be bracing now for the part where this turns ugly. It does not. What came next was not more argument. It was 2 more clocks, chosen for one reason above all others. They cannot fail in the way that ditch grass fails. The first of them was pollen. Conifers grew on the higher ground around that basin, as they still do. Every spring their pollen blew out over the water as a fine dust, and settled into the very same mud as the seeds. Conifer pollen is the opposite of ditch grass in the one way that matters here. A pine stands in open air and breathes the atmosphere, exactly like every land plant you have ever walked past. It cannot drink old dissolved carbon out of a lake, because it never touches the lake at all. The reservoir problem you have just heard about does not apply to it. There was one obstacle, and it was purely practical. Pollen grains are minute. A radiocarbon date needs a real quantity of material, and it needs that material to be pure. One stray fragment of something else moves the number. So they used a machine that sorts single grains, 1 grain at a time. You can picture the sample drawn past a beam of light in a thin stream. Each grain is read for its size and shape and optical signature. Conifer pollen flicked into one channel and everything else into the other. Tens of thousands of grains in a single sample and nothing else in it. Then they dated that. A land plant, breathing ordinary air taken from the same layers above and below the prints, and the answer came back inside the same window as the seeds. The second clock has nothing to do with carbon at all, and I love this one because it is such a strange and human idea. It is called optically stimulated luminescence, and what it measures is sunlight, or rather the absence of sunlight. Hold a grain of quartz sand in your mind. While it lies buried in the dark, the ground around it is very faintly radioactive, as all ground everywhere is, and that radiation knocks electrons loose inside the crystal. Some of them are caught in flaws in the lattice and held there. They pile up, slowly and steadily, for as long as the grain stays out of the light. Sunlight releases them. A few minutes of daylight empties those traps completely and sets the grain back to zero. So a buried quartz grain is a very small battery. It began charging on the last day it saw the sun. You can guess how a sample like that has to be collected. In darkness, and kept in darkness, all the way to the laboratory bench. There a controlled light is shown on it, and the grain gives back what it has been holding as a faint glow. You measure that glow. You measure how radioactive the surrounding sediment is, set one against the other, and out comes the number of years since that grain last lay in daylight. Nothing in that involves carbon. Different atoms, different assumptions, different instruments, different ways of going wrong. The quartz agreed. Now hold all three of them together in your head, because this is the whole point. Seeds, which could read too old, and would fail by drinking old water. Pollen, which cannot fail that way, because it breathed the open sky above the lake instead. And quartz, which does not know what carbon is, and whose weaknesses are entirely its own. A grain not fully bleached before burial, a dose rate misjudged. 3 methods and 3 separate ways of being wrong. For the answer to be wrong, all 3 would have to be wrong, in the same direction, by roughly the same amount by coincidence. They agreed. I want to name what that is, because it is not the story you usually get told about scientists. Nobody was humiliated here. The doubters were not villains, and they were not shouted down. They asked the hardest fair question available, and the claim went away and came back carrying 2 independent answers. So the objection did not weaken the finding. The objection is the reason the finding is worth anything at all. That is what this looks like when it works, rather than when it embarrasses itself. And still, I want you to hold it the way the people who work out there hold it, which is not as a slogan. The dates are a window rather than a single year, and you should hear them that way. The honest phrasing is always a range with a probability attached to it. There is live discussion about how tightly the prints tie to the exact layers that were dated. There is a fair question about whether some of the pollen could have washed in from older ground nearby. Each of those is being worked on right now, with more material from more depths by people who would be delighted to find the flaw. So far, the window has held. I want you to hear that phrase properly. So far. That is not a weakness, and you should be more suspicious of any version that leaves it out. It is the only honest way to hold a date. If this is ever overturned, it will be overturned by the same machinery that tested it, and building that machinery is the entire point of the exercise. But something has quietly changed while you have been lying there listening. Of the 3 things I asked you at the very beginning, one has stopped being a question. Someone was walking barefoot along that lake edge thousands of years before anybody was supposed to be standing anywhere on that continent. Not a rumour, and not one lucky sample. 3 clocks, 3 different kinds of physics, 1 answer, which leaves you the other 2, and they are heavier now than they were, because they have stopped being hypothetical. How did they get there, to a land that was supposed to be sealed behind ice? And why, if they were here so early, is there so nearly nothing left of them? Those 2, as it turns out, are the same answer. Which brings us back to the thing nobody could explain. A line of bare footprints pressed into the mud of a lake that dried up long ago on a white flat in southern New Mexico. Someone walked there without shoes, and the ground kept it. You have been carrying 3 questions all this time. Who was walking there? How they reached a continent that was supposed to be sealed? And why so little else of them is left? All 3 can be answered now, and I would like to answer them for you plainly. Not with certainty everywhere. I will show you exactly where the certainty runs out, and I would rather do that than tie a bow on it. Start with who. They were people. That is the whole of the answer, and it is far larger than it sounds. Not an early version of people, and not a rehearsal for anybody who came afterward. They were fully modern human beings, with the same body you are resting in tonight, the same hands, the same eyes adjusted to the same low light. They made fire, carried it, and knew how to bring it back from almost nothing. They twisted plant fibre into cordage, and cordage into line and net and snare. They knew wood and hide and stone, and how each one behaves when it is cold. They read the weather off the colour of a sky. They had language, full language with grammar in it, and jokes and argument, and a name for every animal that crossed their ground. They had stories about how those animals came to be, and songs and games for children. They had grief and care for the dead, and a clear sense of what is owed to other people. And they had a long history of their own before any of that, which is the part that slips away easiest. The walkers did not begin at that lake. They arrived at it carrying tens of thousands of years of inheritance, skills worked out on other coasts, in other cold, by people whose names are gone. So when you picture them, do not picture a beginning. Picture somebody already far along in a story that was old. They are the ancestors of living peoples, and that sentence is not a courtesy. It is the fact of the matter. Their descendants are not a memory and not a museum case. They are here, in this century, on that same ground, with their own languages and their own long accounts of where they came from. Many of those accounts have said for a very long time that their people have always been here. The science has spent 60 years moving in their direction, and it is still moving. That is who was walking there. Now the second question, and it is the one that used to start the arguments. How do you reach a continent standing behind 2 walls of ice? Not the way you were taught, and you know that part already. The corridor between the ice sheets opened too late to have been the first road, and when it did finally open it was bare. Nothing growing along it yet, nothing to hunt, nothing to gather, no fuel for a fire. A road you cannot eat on is not a road. So that is not how the first people came, and it cannot have been. The likely answer is water and an edge. A coast. A long, cold, generous edge running south, with kelp standing in the shallows, and fish and seals and shellfish inside it, and driftwood on the beaches for fire. That edge was continuous, and it did not care about the ice sheets, because it ran along the front of them. People who already knew boats and tides and how to read a shoreline could simply follow it. It is the answer that fits the dates and the distances and the shape of the land. It is also the answer we can least easily test. But hold the picture steady, because this is the part that is easy to get wrong. It was not a voyage. Nobody launched a boat to go and discover a continent, because nobody knew a continent was there. What moved south was not an expedition at all. It was a way of living. Think of a family, over one lifetime, finding a slightly better bay than the one they were born beside. Then their children find another, a few days further along the same shore. Then their children do the same. Nothing dramatic ever happens, and nobody crosses a line. Every single move is small and reasonable, and it is about food, or shelter, or somebody they wanted to be near. Give that a few hundred generations, and you have crossed a hemisphere without one person ever meaning to. That is how you reach a sealed continent. You do not break in. You go around the edge, slowly, and the edge feeds you the whole way. Which brings us to your third question, and to the simplest and the saddest answer of the three. Why is there so little left of them? Because the world they moved through is under the sea. Stay with that for a moment, because it explains nearly everything you have been wondering about tonight. When the ice let go, the water it had been holding went back where it came from, and the ocean rose about 120 meters. That is not a tide, and it is not a flood. That is the shape of every coast on earth being redrawn over thousands of years, quietly, about a hand's width in a lifetime. Nobody living through it would have called it a disaster. You would simply have called it the way the world is. Now think about what that coast had been. It was the best ground in the whole story. It was where the food was, where the fresh water met the salt, where you could pull a boat up and sleep dry. It is exactly where you would expect people to live. Densest and longest and most settled. And it is exactly the ground that went under first. Every camp along that shoreline, every hearth, every shell heap, every worked piece of wood, every place a boat was hauled out of the water, not eroded away. Drowned it is out there tonight, tens of miles offshore in a great many places, under cold dark water and buried in marine sediment. And you would need a ship and a very good day to go and look at any of it. So the record is not thin because those people were few. The record is thin because it lies at the bottom of the sea. Those are completely different statements, and for 60 years the field read the first one, when the truth was the second. And that, in the end, is what the footprints really overturn. Not a date. A habit of mind. For about 60 years, the story of this continent's first people rested on something that felt like evidence, and was not. Nobody had found anything older. Therefore it was decided nothing older was there. That is the whole of the logic, said out loud, and you can hear how thin it is when you say it slowly. Absence of evidence, taken as evidence of absence. It is such an easy mistake to make. You would have made it, and so would I. And the people who did make it were careful and serious. But underneath it sits a quiet assumption, which is that the past has left you a fair sample of itself. It has not. It never does. Here is the thing I would like you to carry away from all of this. The record we have is not the record that existed. It is only the fraction that happened to survive, and survival is not a measure of how many people there were, or how long they were there, or how much they knew. Survival is a measure of luck, of whether a thing fell into a bog instead of a river, of whether the mud went quiet instead of washing out, of whether the sea stayed where it was. Almost everything ever made by human hands is gone, and what you and I study is the residue that is left. When a whole continent's worth of coastline goes under 120 metres of water, that residue is not simply smaller than it was. It is bent in one particular direction against exactly the people you are trying to see. So the honest turn at the end of this is not a triumph, it is humility. That is not a defeat, it is a better instrument. The moment a record is understood to be partial, the questions asked of it change. They stop being about what is there and start being about what could possibly have lasted. And that same honesty means, I owe you what is still open, rather than an ending that closes too neatly. The date of first arrival is not known. The footprints give you a minimum, and a minimum is not a beginning. Somebody was walking beside that lake, which means somebody arrived before that and had already come thousands of miles south of the ice. How long before, nobody can tell you. It might be a little. It might be a great deal. Whether there was one arrival or several is not known either. It may have been a single long population, moving south in a slow braid over many centuries. It may have been separate groups at separate times, some of whom found the coast, and some of whom did not. The genetics is suggestive. The sample is small, and the sites that would settle the question are, once again, underwater. Both pictures fit the evidence we have. Neither can be ruled out. And what became of the very earliest groups is the deepest open question of all. Whether their descendants are among the peoples living on that land now. Whether their line thinned or joined with others, or ran straight through unbroken. Confident answers to this do exist, and they are easy to find. Be gentle with them. The truthful position is that we do not yet know, and that the descendant communities themselves belong in the work of finding out. So this is not an ending, and I am not going to hand you one. It is a door left open on purpose, because that is what the evidence honestly supports. What we can say is small and solid, and it is all I would like you to hold as you settle. Somebody walked across wet ground on a cold morning, barefoot, a very long time ago. The lake was real, and the morning was real. The feet were bare, and the mud took the shape of them, and then the mud dried and waited. They were not a beginning, they were already far along in a story, and that story has not stopped. And there is one more thing to say about those prints. It is not about ice, or water, or dates at all. It is about the keeping. Set every argument down for a moment, and what is left underneath it is very small and very strange. The ground held on. It did not have to. Nothing about that afternoon was meant to last, and nobody there would have thought it worth recording. Somebody was on the way to somewhere else, and the ground they crossed was soft, and that is the entire event. Then the sun came and hardened it. Then the wind laid a fine pale sand over the top, and the lake rose and fell for thousands of years, and at last gave up altogether. And through every part of that, the ground quietly went on holding what it had been handed. It kept it while the valley turned white. It kept it while every language you have ever heard spoken was invented, and used for a while, and then forgotten and replaced by another one, over and over, for longer than the mind comfortably holds. Sit with the length of that for a moment. No building anywhere on this earth is that old. Not one. The oldest walls that anyone has ever found are a small fraction of that age, and so is every temple you could name, every tomb, every carved gate, every mile of ancient road. All of it is younger, by many thousands of years, than a footprint somebody left by accident on the way to doing something ordinary. You can measure it in your own family instead. Count backwards, one person at a time, a life for every step, and you would need something like 800 of them to reach the walker at the lake. 800 faces. 800 fires or kitchens or quiet rooms, and the footprint outlasted every one of them. That is the part that stays with me longest. Nobody was trying. Nobody carved a name into anything, and nobody stacked stone on a hilltop so that a stranger would one day stand there and wonder about them. There was only a walk across soft ground, and a lake that happened to dry in exactly the right way, and then an unreasonable amount of luck. Here is something to try. The next time you are somewhere with wet sand under your feet, take a few steps and turn around. Your own prints will be there for a moment, sharp at the edges, with a little ridge of sand pushed up at the toe. Then the water slides in, or the sides slump, and the whole thing softens and is gone inside a minute. That is the ordinary fate of a footprint, and it is exactly why the ones you have been holding in mind all evening are so quietly astonishing. Yours will last a minute. Someone else's has lasted more than 20,000 years, and you can still see the place where they turned. You will never know a single thing about them. Not a name, not an age, not what they were carrying, not whether the water was cold that day. You know one thing only. They were there, and they were walking, and their feet were bare on soft ground. And I think that ought to change the way you feel about everything that is missing from the deep past. Because the ordinary is precisely the thing that does not survive. Think about what the past actually hands over to you. The hard things, the deep things, and the things that happen to be dropped somewhere cold or dry or airless. Stone lasts. Fired clay lasts. Bone lasts sometimes, in a cave, at a steady temperature, if nothing comes along to disturb it. Almost nothing else does. A basket does not last, and neither does a net, a wooden bowl, a hide bag, a coiled length of rope, or a boat. Neither does a song. A joke, a nickname, or the particular way that somebody laughed. Whole lives were carried in materials that have gone completely. So when what is left of a distant people looks thin to you, remember that the thinness is mostly a fact about mud and air and salt water. It is not a fact about them. So the record any of us inherits is not a photograph of the past. It is a sieve. What comes through it tells you which materials happen to endure, and almost nothing about how full or how clever or how affectionate a life was. Which is why I would put it to you the other way round tonight. Those early people did not leave next to nothing behind them. They left an ordinary amount, the same as anybody, and it is the world they left it in that has moved since. The shore they walked is out under the water now, dark and cold and very hard to reach. The valley floors are under dune fields. The old camps are under lakes and fields and roads and towns, under car parks and orchards and somebody's back garden. And a great deal of it lies under water. The past is not gone. Most of it is simply underneath something. And it is being held rather well down there, out of the light and out of the air. Silt is patient, and so is sand, and cold dark water is astonishingly patient. None of them are in any rush to hand anything back. Somewhere off a coastline tonight, far out under the cold and the dark, a stretch of old shore is lying with the shape of somebody's camp still on it. Nobody has seen it. Nobody may ever see it. It is there anyway, and it does not need to be found in order to be real. Waiting is the wrong word for that, and I keep using it anyway. Nothing down there is impatient, and nothing is counting the years until somebody arrives with a light. It is simply being kept, in the dark, in the cold, the way that mud kept a heel on a summer afternoon. Kept is the better word for it, and a gentler one. I find that a restful thought rather than a frustrating one, and I hope that you can too. The world has not been emptied out behind us. It is mostly still holding things, quietly, the way a house holds everything in the rooms that you are not currently standing in. There is one more thing, and it matters more to me than any of the dating did. You will hear that whole deep past called a lost world, and its people called a lost race. I would rather you did not carry those words out of tonight with you. They are wrong in every direction. Nobody was a rehearsal for somebody else. The peoples of those two continents are living peoples, with living languages and laws and place names and jokes, and children asleep at this very hour while you are lying there listening to me. And they are not a footnote to any of this. They are the part of it that is still being lived. And they have their own account of where they come from. It is far older than any laboratory, and it was carried in memory and language and story rather than in journals. And it was never waiting on anybody's permission to be true. Much of it says something very simple. That they have been here a very long time, and that they have been here from the beginning as they understand the beginning. So look at the way the dates have moved, and you may notice something rather gentle happening underneath it all. The science has been walking slowly toward a door that was already open, and it got there late, and with a great deal of argument. You can take that as a small and quiet correction, and it is a good note to end on. So let the picture come back one last time, and let it be the one that you keep. You are out on the white flat again, late in the evening, with the dunes standing behind you. Gypsum holds the last of the light the way that snow does, so the ground stays faintly bright even now, even with the sun long down behind the mountains. The air has cooled. There is no sound out here at all except the wind, and the wind is in no hurry whatsoever. It comes low across the ground, moving a thin skin of white sand along with it, grain over grain. The sound of that is like slow breathing in another room. Nothing else moves out here. The dunes hold their shape against the last of the light, and the flat runs away in every direction, level and pale and empty. The mountains are a dark line along the edge of everything. The ground gives up the last of the day's warmth slowly, so the flat stays a shade warmer than the air above it. The lake has been gone so long that nothing out here remembers it as water. Where it stood there is a pale flat floor, and a little way under it the ground is still holding what it was given. The prints are down there now, in the dark, bare feet, in old mud. You know what they look like, because you have been carrying that picture all evening. The toes spread a little where the walker pushed away. The heel set deeper on the softer side, and there is the place where they turned and paused over something and went on. They are not going anywhere tonight. They have lain like that through more nights than anyone could ever count, through every winter since, through the whole of everything that came afterwards. Whole ages of weather have gone over the top of them without leaving a mark on them, and tonight is only one more of those nights. The prints have simply stayed where they were put, holding their shape under the sand, in the cool and the quiet and the dark. Nothing out there is waiting on anything. Nothing needs settling before morning. The wind moves over the flat and keeps moving. It goes out across the white ground and away toward the mountains, the way that it has gone every night for more than 20,000 years. It will still be doing that when you wake. So let your breathing slow down now. Let the room go soft at its edges. Let the day drift a little further away with every breath that you take. The ground has held this long. It will go on holding while you sleep. Somewhere out there, under a few inches of white sand, an ordinary afternoon is lying exactly where it was left. Quiet, undisturbed, kept. The flat is white and still. The wind moves over it, low and slow. The prints lie under the sand, in the dark. And it is time to be still now. Let the night settle around you. Rest well, sleep well.